that's why a lot of people often fail with their goals, because they're doing it for the wrong reasons. Stop putting a time limit on your habits, because habits are for life, not just for January. What does it take to create lasting change?
I mean, that's the secret sauce right there. We have to think about the behaviors that lead to the outcome, because the outcome you can't necessarily control. You can't necessarily, like you may or may not lose the weight in the time frame that you've set, but what you can control is the behaviors that contribute to that outcome goal. Would you agree with that? Disagree with that? Anything to say on that perspective or that line of thinking?
Yes. Where do I start? So much to say. No, it's so, yeah, what you said is really profound, that, it's so often when New Year comes around and we're like, right, that's it. This year, I'm going to exercise every day. I'm going to lift weights in the gym. I'm going to give up sugar. I'm going to give up alcohol. I'm going to be nice to my other half. I'm going to be good with the kids. I'm never going to lose my temper. I'm going to save. And, the more goals we add in, the more we take away from our focal goal. And there's two things there. And the first I'll speak to is goal dilution. So, more we add in, the more we take away. And it makes it harder for us to achieve that particular goal, because we're trying to do too much at once. And why is that difficult? Because willpower is a limited resource. And so willpower can be depleted. And so willpower is a little bit like a muscle. So if we went to the gym for the next 7 days and just trained our right bicep, by the time I get to the end of the week, I wouldn't be able to pick up a cup of tea.
Right.
but if I went once a week for the next 7 weeks, it's much more habit forming. And just like a muscle, we need to have rest and recovery in order to get stronger over time. And that's exactly how willpower works. It gets depleted over time. And that's why it's really, really important, like you said, to actually focus on those small steps in the process rather than the outcome alone. And there's a lot of research around this about small steps. And I'll actually come back to that, because I want to speak to the second thing that you said about outcome goals. And this is another thing where people tend to go wrong. So we focus on the number. Say it's the number of miles on our fitness tracker, or it's the number on the scales, or the number on our paychecks, or whatever it happens to be. And we think that that's the particular thing that we need to keep us motivated. But actually, that's only going to last for a short while. Those kind of goals only last about six weeks, that they're snapshots in time, they're particular numbers. If we focus on numbers alone, that often evokes extrinsic motivation. And extrinsic motivation is the type of motivation I call slippy motivation, because it's hard to grasp onto. And extrinsic motivation is things that you're doing it for performance, appearance, or number-based reasons.
Status. Something like that.
Exactly. You're doing it for the social media likes. You're doing it for everyone in the office to say, well done. You're doing it because your doctor told you to do it. You're not doing it for you. And that's why they're slippy goals. They're hard to hold on to. And they only represent a snapshot in time as well. If we look at a gold medal winner, if they're so focused just on that gold medal alone, often when they get there, there's this phenomenon in the Olympics called the gold medal blues, where people feel a bit lost afterwards. And, then they try and step it up. We see it with weight loss all the time. People get to their target weight and then they're like, okay, now I've got to push harder.
Now what?
I've got to go further.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But the opposite of that is intrinsic motivation and intrinsic goals. And those are goals that you're doing it for you. You're doing it because it's personally meaningful for you. You're doing it because it's important for you. And I call those sticky goals. And intrinsic is a beautiful word because it translates in Latin into the word inward, or goods for the soul. And that's essentially what it is. And before we start out on any health kick, or before we try and develop any habit, we have to ask ourselves, why is this important for me and me alone? Because that's why a lot of people often fail with their goals, because they're doing it for the wrong reasons and they're not doing it for themselves. And that can actually help people decipher, is this a goal that actually I want to follow? I truly want to follow, or am I just doing this because everyone else is doing it? Right. And the way to really get to that, Stephanie, is to ask yourself, why is it important? And act like a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old here and say, keep asking yourself why. So, for example, if someone says, well, I need to get to 10,000 steps on my fitness tracker. Why is that important? Oh, because I want to exercise more. Why is that important? Oh, well, because I want to have more energy. Why is that important? See, I'm the annoying 2 or 3-year-old. And once you ask enough whys, they might be like, well, actually, I need more energy to apply myself at work. or I want to give back to my community, or I want to be a role model for my children, or I want to feel like I can be my full self each day, or I want to have confidence, or I want to have vitality, and exercise enables and allows me to do that. That's an intrinsic goal. So if anyone wants to find out, are their goals truly intrinsic? Ask yourself why. Ask yourself why enough times. Why is it important to me? And you can get to that true why. And that true why makes those goals so much more sticky. So when you're in the trenches, you're not like, oh, well, I'm just doing this because I'm trying to get 10K a day on my fitness tracker. You're doing it because of what it gives you back and who it allows you to be in your life. And those goals are much more sustainable than those when you focus on the outcome alone.
This is so powerful. And I think such an important thing for my listeners to hear about, because one of the things I think that is maybe a tragic flaw potentially of the human race is that we just grossly underestimate what our motivation is going to be like in the future when you are setting a goal that is very big. So that might be, exercising 4 or 5 times a week. It might be the number on the scale or the number on the paycheck or any of the examples that you gave. And I think I really like the distinction or the delineation between the extrinsic and the intrinsic, because we often without evaluation will say, well, it's like this keeping up with the Joneses kind of idea where we're like, well, so-and-so is doing it, so therefore I should want to do this. They're doing an ice bucket challenge. I should do an ice bucket challenge. They're posting.
Don't do an ice bucket challenge. It's horrible. Just give money.
Yeah, just donate. If ALS is a really important cause for you, then just donate, just donate the money. At the time of this recording right now, what we're seeing, at least what I'm observing on social media, is everybody's posting these sort of AI generated images of themselves. And it's like, all right, are we doing this is this egoically driven? Like, why is everybody doing this on social? And by the time this episode airs, people are like, what is she talking about? But if you are right now on Instagram, everyone has AI photos of themselves. And so I wanted to talk a little bit, like just double click a little bit on motivation, because one of the things I have noticed, women, it doesn't matter. It's like sex agnostic. It is an unreliable lever when we are thinking about behavioral change. You can have, let's say, big spikes of motivation for doing like really, really hard things like one time. Like if your child is stuck under a car, you're probably going to find the motivation to try and free that child. Or you might find the motivation one time or maybe 2 times to move homes, or as you said, that behavior, like you have 50 New Year's resolutions, you can keep all 50 of them for like one day, but keeping them for the whole year, maybe not so much. And so I think what we do is when we get excited about setting a goal, we're like, oh, it's going to be great. And I'm going to like go to the gym, and it's going to be like 4 times a week, 5 times a week. And then I'm going to do cardio on top of that. And I'm going to measure all my foods. And then, so you do that for a week and then you're just miserable. Right. And of course, the inevitable happens. Your motivation starts to wane. And so does your application. So let's talk a little bit about how we can move away from motivation. Like motivation is great to start it, but then we need something to continue it. Like you can start on January 1st and say, this is going to be the year. And by golly, like let's make it the year for you. But maybe we start, instead of these gargantuan, like I'm going to run a marathon, I'm going to compete in the CrossFit Games, I'm going to learn 4 languages. How can we move from motivation maybe to, or maybe the better question is, how can we overcome motivation resistance, or when motivation is waning? How do we overcome that to continue to pursue the goal?
Yeah, great. That's just such a fantastic question. And I think you alluded to it there. It's that we need to stop relying on motivation in the first place. And even just admitting that to ourselves, motivation, I often bracket up willpower in the same same bracket.
Yes.
They're limited. And so exactly like you say, Stephanie, when we start out, motivation's up here. And what happens over time is it goes down, and we have to recognize that. We have to understand that motivation goes down over time. But there's this kind of crossover that happens where actually habit is really low at the start. Her habitual tendencies, how much we repeat things in a given context, that's really low. And what we want to do is we want to kind of get this crossover where we don't need the motivation anymore, where the habit starts happening. And I'll talk a little bit about how we do that in a second. But what's quite interesting, and I think a way for people to really get their head around it, is think about this morning. Think about one of the first things you did after you got up. Often people, will brush their teeth first thing in the morning. But it's not like you had to lay in bed, weighing up the pros and cons of dental hygiene, or deciding if you're in the toothbrushing kind of zone, or you had to go look in the mirror and say, I'm the toothbrushing type of person, or read 7 Habits of Highly Effective Toothbrushers. You did it because it's a habit that you had. It's an automatic, context dependent, non-conscious process. And that's the beautiful thing about habits, is we don't have to use any motivation to create them. They're automatic. Now, they require a little bit of motivation at the start to actually start them and ignite them and put those environmental processes in place that actually will support them. But once you kind of get to that habit overlap, you don't need the motivation anymore. And actually the habit takes over. But where people fall down is how long they think that takes. And often, you probably have heard, people talk about it takes 21 days to form a habit, or 28 days to form a habit. And unfortunately, it takes a lot longer than that. And actually, a lot of
I've heard people actually completely dispute that. So I've had a couple of people say it's not 21, it's like 63. And then I've had other people on the show who've said it's actually not 63. It's actually nothing. Like, so you're talking about this like crossover between motivation coming down and habit formation. And then I've had other people challenge this idea that if there's no prompt or there's no ability or skill set, kind of what you're talking about, like you don't have to look in the mirror and be like, you're a toothbrushing kind of person. Yeah. You can do it. Like there's almost this competency or core set of, because if you look at like a 2-year-old, let's say, any mom knows that like your toddler, it's like a hit or miss whether or not they're going to brush their teeth. You have to prompt them, right? You have to say, all right, honey, it's time to, like, in the morning we go to the bathroom, we do potty, and then we brush our teeth, and then we, whatever. And that takes several years of conditioning. As you were saying, right? Motivation, and maybe the toddler isn't even motivated to brush their teeth. They don't actually understand the utility of it, but their habit, as you were, their habit, there's that intersection where the habit and the acquisition of skill gets better over time so that we can move it into automation as well. So I don't know what your thoughts are in terms of how long it takes. I'm actually confused on this. I don't know if it's 21 days, 63 or 4 days, or it's just, you need to have some sort of, you have to set up your environment for prompts to like if your toothbrush is like charged, if you have like an electric toothbrush or something and it's like right there waiting for you, like, oh yeah, toothbrush.
Yeah. Well, so let's think about the habit myth for a minute, and the 21 days myth. And so that actually comes from research from the 60s. I don't know if you've heard about this. There's a surgeon called Maxwell Maltz, and he wrote this book called Psycho-Cybernetics, and it was about his plastic surgery patients. And what they found on average was it took them 21 days to adapt to their new appearance. And somehow that got taken up in the media. And it was thought that that's how long it took for people to adapt to new behaviors. There's also an equally wacky study that was supposedly on NASA scientists, where they were testing spatial disorientation, and they put goggles on the NASA scientists that flipped their vision 180 degrees, and they got them to live as long as possible with their vision upside down, which obviously there was a huge attrition rate in that study. But those that kept it going, so their vision was completely flipped upside down, supposedly after 28 days, their vision flipped the right way up. And therefore, if spatial disorientation can happen in NASA scientists, for some reason that got taken up that's how long it takes for human behavior to change. Again,
very odd extraction. That's that's like reach. There's that's a big reach.
Absolutely. And I think the thing is that, the media, says these things like 21, 28, because it makes habit change feel more accessible. And, there's nothing I want more than a habit change to be accessible, but I also want people to know the truth. And the truth is that habits take a long time to form. Like you just said, a 2-year-old, reminding them to brush their teeth, how many countless times you can have to do that over the years. And then when they become a teenager, it starts all over again.
Yes, yeah.
But the interesting thing is that there is research from University College London on this, and they found that it took anything between 18 and 254 days to create a habit. And they define a habit as the time that it took to get to automaticity. So automaticity is you're doing it without thinking. So you get into the car, you put on your seatbelt, you don't even think about it. It's just automatic. You wake up in the morning, you take out your phone, you check your social media, you're not even thinking about it. It's just automatic. And they kind of came around this number of 66 or 2 months, but that completely was dependent on how complex the habit was. And this goes back to what you were saying, Stephanie, like those simpler habits, those smaller habits, or smaller changes, they become habitual more easily. So, drinking that extra glass of water is much more easy to adopt over time than a more complex habit like going to the gym. And that's why it's so, so important when it comes to habit change that we scale back, that we look at those tiny, tiny, tiny small changes. But just to put a wrap around that, whether it takes 22 or 122 days, it doesn't matter, as long as you're forming a habit, because if you're no longer doing it, it's no longer a habit either. And so the key is once a habit is formed, they tend to last. We don't have to think about them. They don't use our willpower. They don't use our motivation. And so we need to stop putting time limits on ourselves when it comes to habits and actually look at them like experimentation in the first while, looking at, well, where does this fit in the context of my life? How can I find those cues that actually will make me repeat this more often? So for example, toothbrushing in the morning, the context, the cue is you wake up, you go into the bathroom, you see your fully charged toothbrush there. It reminds you that that's a cue. You've been repeating this behavior time and time again in this exact similar context. If you go to many other places around the world, it's going to be the first thing that you think about when you get up in the morning, because you've repeated it often enough that it's become a habit. So how do we create that with our other habits? We want to make them as simple and as easy to do. And I like to say you want to be able to almost trip over your habits that they're so simple. And that's where environmental cues and other factors come in. But I think just to lay this kind of myth to rest for people, I would say stop putting a time limit on your habits, because habits are for life, not just for January. It's not like we just brush our teeth in January and then our dental hygiene is done for the year. If we're no longer doing it, it's no longer a habit. And so we need to think about our habits long term. Let's stop thinking about 4 days, 40 days, 4 months. Let's start thinking about 4 years, 40 years. What do we want this to look like in 4 years, 5 years, 6 years time? And I think that's a much more safe approach, and it's a much more compassionate approach to creating long-term change.
As you were talking, I had this image of a meme. I'll see if I can find it for the show notes, but it's, the person's like, I had one salad this week and I don't have abs yet, so I give up. It's like, I did it good one time and I'm not getting the results. Like, why not? You said something that I wanted to just highlight for a moment, and that was when we bring the goal post, or when we bring the habit down to like the small, the minuscule. I think a lot of people struggle with that, partially because I think there's messaging, let's say, in our culture that is around like go big or go home. If there's not any big goal that you're striving for, like it's not worth doing. And I would say, just as someone who tends to be an overachiever, like you'll never find anyone harder on myself than me, right? Like I'm always going to be the person who pushes myself the furthest, and I will set the goals for myself. I too struggle with setting smaller habits, because it almost, for like an all or nothing type of personality, which I certainly have those characteristics. Like if I have the option between all or nothing, and I know I can't have it all, I choose nothing. I'm like, well, if I can't work out 400 hours a week, or whatever it is, right? If I can't learn 2 languages at the same time, then why even bother learning one? It's kind of this like fatalistic, nihilistic, like, well, just screw everything then, and I'm not going to do it. So what do you say to, and I hope that I'm not the only one like on this podcast, like hopefully some of the listeners are like, yeah, I can get what she's saying there. Like, it's not just like, I'm just not the the pathology here, but what would you say to someone who skews into that very, I call it more of a type A personality, but I would almost say there's like some rigidity to the personality, like trying to control, and we can unpack why that is and trauma responses and all the things. But for someone who tends to like to control their environment, how do you counsel someone to say, okay, like it's okay to set a smaller goal? Like that doesn't mean you're a failure. It doesn't mean that you have some sort of core incompetency. How do we get around that maybe egoic resistance?
Yeah. And a great question, and it's something a lot of people struggle with. So you're not alone in that, And as you just alluded to, we might eat well all week, and then on Thursday we go into the office and there's a birthday cake, and we're like, oh well, I've had this now. I might as well just eat what I want for the weekend, and then I'll start again on Monday, or the first of the month, or after this holiday, or whatever it is. So there's two things on that. And I'll come back to the small changes and actually what we can derive from sports psychology and what we've learned from that around that. But to speak directly to the fact that this all or nothing behavior, and actually just did a workshop on this with the company about how to find balance this festive season. And they're a real they're a lifestyle behavior company, and they've got wellbeing apps and everything. So they're super, high chargers and really like dedicated and motivated and everything else. But they say that every year Christmas comes around, the holiday season, and their habits go out the window. And we talked about actually, for people that tend to be quite all or nothing, the thing is that habits need to be scaled. So, let's look at like what's a 10 out of 10 for you. So Stephanie, 10 out of 10 for you from a fitness point of view might be, 3 HIIT sessions and 2 runs a week. Well, what's a 9? And what's an 8? And what's a 5? And we scale all the way back to a 1. 1 might be, okay, I just get in 3 walks this week. And what's quite interesting about that is that actually you're still able to serve your value of being healthy, but it just doesn't have to be a 10 out of 10 all the time. A lot of people struggled. A lot of people struggled to find their 9s, their 8s, and their 7s, and they had to experiment a little bit. But it's really, really important, because actually what the new emerging research in habit science shows that actually flexible habits are much more sustainable. So actually, it's not always about doing the same thing at 10 p.m. or at 10 a.m. every single day. It's actually that you can do it in a circumstance that feels intuitive. You can do it in whether you're on holidays, whether you're abroad, whether you're working, whether, you can start to understand and see the benefits that you get out of this habit, regardless of the circumstance. So it's not like, oh, well, if I can't do it at 10 a.m. on a Thursday, then I'm not doing it at all. It's like, well, what does this look like in different contexts? And one of the best ways to introduce yourself to that is to look at your habits on a scale. And so maybe it's a meditation habit, or maybe it's a nutrition habit. If 10 out of 10 for you is, having 5 extra vegetables each week, what's a 4? What's a 3? Maybe it's just having 1. Maybe it's having a healthy breakfast. And this is really important, because we believe, and this goes back to what you said, Stephanie, so insightfully about the motivation curve. We believe that our future self is never going to be subject to stress. They're never going to be fatigued. They're never going to be depleted. They're never going to be angry at their kids or having to deal with a nasty boss or anything like that. They're all things that deplete our willpower, and we will all suffer from willpower depletion at some stage. And so we need to look at, well, what can we do in circumstances that are less than perfect? And what they call this in psychology is implementation intentions. And so what that is you're creating a plan for when things go off track. And let me tell you now, everything will go off track at one time or another. And it's a beautiful test of your habit strength, of your habit resilience. And so the thing is, you have to have a plan for when you cannot be perfect. And that's where a lot of people fall down, because they think, well, it's got to be the 3 HIIT sessions and the 2 runs a week, or it's nothing at all. But actually what we need to look at is, how can we scale our habits on that scale of 1 to 10? And how can we experiment with doing it differently at different times of our life? Because our lives will ebb and flow. But if we can consistently show up in different ways, we're much more likely actually to sustain that habit. And it actually, from a neurological point of view, helps our brain stop thinking in such a black and white way. It stops our brain from thinking it's got to be all or nothing. Because every time you do a new possibility, every time you do a 7 on your scale, or a 6 or a 3, you tell your brain, oh, there's something else I can do in this circumstance. So say you go out for a run and it's lashing rain, or, the weather is really cold or it's really icy. And you say, well, that's it. I can't go for a run. That tells your brain, okay, well, it's either good weather or nothing. Whereas actually when you start to if you do like an online strength training for runners, a session at that time instead, it tells your brain there's another option. And it helps you actually look at, well, how can I still serve this habit in different ways?
I love that so much, because as you were, I used to be very much like that. It's like, if I didn't work out and it wasn't completed by 7:30 or 8 in the morning, then the whole day was a wash. Like that's how I used to approach fitness and what have you. And then of course, kids come along, and, I had, a child with me this morning, kind of feeling a little sick and like needed some extra cuddles this morning. So the time that I had dedicated this morning, for example, for my training didn't get done. And so what I'm doing is, after we finish our recording together, is I'm slipping in my workout that was supposed, and it's not the end of the world. And I can really, I was not like that for many years. It was like, you're doing this. And it was very drill sergeant in my mind, like, you can't act like this or else. And I do feel like there's been a bit of a softening. That might be with age, that might be, being a mother, and sort of understanding that, we have to have a lot of patience with even our children to help facilitate their own habit formation. And maybe that's integrated somehow into me, but I love, what you're saying. And I wanted to maybe just stay on motivation just for one more moment, because you mentioned a scenario where, you've been good all week, and then you go into the office on Thursday and there's a birthday cake. So these are like kind of competing motivations, right? It's like, on the one hand, it's like, I want to reduce the sugars in my diet, or I'm eating a whole foods diet. Maybe that's one sort of motivation. And then the competing motivation is like, man, I really want that chocolate cake. Right? So how do we navigate, these conflicts, or I'll say competing motivations, and how do we allow, let's say, the one that we want to prevail, which hopefully is the, whole food diet. I'm trying to reduce my weight, let's say, or whatever it is. How do we facilitate, the question is, how do we navigate those competing motivations with each other?
Yeah. And I wish there was just one answer to that, which is do this, but unfortunately there isn't. But there are several different studies on things that could help. So I'll speak to those. And the very first thing is, and you talk a lot about this, Stephanie, but is sleep. Our willpower, our ability to resist temptation, our ability to regulate our hormones, all of that goes down to sleep. So we have much better self-control in the moment, momentary self-control, when we've slept better. And so that is why sleep is just so important in so many ways. We could talk for days on that, but that's one thing. So it's important to understand and know that when you're underslept or you're fatigued, you are more vulnerable to giving into temptation, and you're much more likely to actually have those raised hormones that actually increase appetite and make it more likely, because you're seeking out energy, you're looking for energy in different places. And again, that goes back to other habits, which are things like rest and recovery, and the importance of those habits. And I always say, people talk about good and bad habits. I like to say helpful and unhelpful habits, because actually every so-called bad habit or unhelpful habit always has a root, always has a foundation. So if we're eating out of stress, or we find ourselves giving into temptation a lot more, there's always a reason behind that. And if we dig deep enough, we can truly find that reason. And that's how we kind of unravel an unhelpful habit. But I'll come back to that. So I want to answer your question. I don't want to skirt around it. But one of the other things then, what they found in studies is when people were presented, there's a researcher that's done a bit of interesting work on this. She's out of Chicago, Booth University. Her name's Isla Fishback. And she had a book out recently, which I will remember the name of shortly. But she talks a lot about this motivation in the moment and when we're presented with temptation. And what they did in this study was that when people had finished a workout in the gym or they were coming into the gym, they presented them with some healthy snacks and some unhealthy snacks. And they had two groups. They had a control group where they just said to them, which snack would you prefer? And then they had the experimental group, which they asked them to think about their intrinsic goal. So to think about why their health goal is important to them that day. And those that were reminded of their health goal, those that were reminded of their intrinsic goal, were much more likely to actually see that temptation to have the unhealthy snacks was temporary, and actually that their long-term goal was more important. And that's why, Simon Sinek says, start with why. And I like to emphasize, it's important to have that sticky motivation, that intrinsic motivation, but it's also why it's important to keep it really salient and remind yourself of it. And not in a way to punish yourself or beat yourself up, but ask yourself, is this choice in line with what I want to be, who I wish to represent in the world right now? Is this in line with what I ultimately want to achieve for myself? And if you can answer that in a way that actually, this is absolutely fine because I've developed the flexibility to bounce back on this. And I know that this isn't going to be one in a series of dominoes. And what they found in research is, and I say this so that people can have the flexibility again, I can't emphasize this as a theme enough in resilient habit change, is flexibility. That's okay to miss once. It's okay to forego your healthy habits once, as long as you pick yourself back up again. And that's the thing. When it becomes 1, 2, 3, 4 times in a row, that's when actually, the new habit we're trying to form actually returns to the older habits. And so it's really, really important that people understand it's absolutely okay to miss once. It's just that repetitive missing that actually is quite dangerous to our long-term pursuit. And there's another number of other things as well that can really support in resisting temptation in the moment. There's a couple of supports you can put in place way before you even get in the position of temptation. And these are really important because studies have shown that those with the greatest self-control or those with the greatest self-regulation or willpower are actually those that use it the least. And what's really interesting from that point of view, and we talked about earlier about willpower depletion, that willpower gets degraded over time. You have an argument with your boss, you have an argument with your spouse, life happens, you've got a sick child, that all depletes your willpower over time and life happens. But if we can engineer our environment to make the healthier choice the easier choice, we're less likely to deplete our willpower. And what I mean by that is, how can you, I like to say to people, do an environmental audit. So look around at your environment and ask yourself, how is it supportive or unsupportive of my healthy habits? So for example, if you're someone who's suffering with anxiety or struggling with focus at work, let's just say, but you've got a million screens open, you've got a million alerts, you've got your phone on the table, your phone in itself is a micro environment. If you look at your homepage of your phone, look at those apps, those notifications you receive first. Are they the ones that are most supportive of your long-term goals? Are the apps, if you want to read more, is it a reading app that's coming up? Are you getting notifications about your meditations? Are you getting notifications about your workouts? Are you getting notifications about your stress management? If those things are important to you, like I said, with intrinsic goals, you want them to be salient as well. So take some time to audit your phone environment, audit your desktop environment, but then also audit your physical environment. Because where the eye line goes, the attention follows, and the brain is cued depending on what's in the environment. So you can reverse engineer your environment to support your habits in a way that, when you open the fridge first, instead of that kind of, birthday cake that's left over from the weekend being the first thing that you see, maybe it's chopped up cherry tomatoes and chopped up, carrots, or, if you're trying to drink more water, having a giant thing of water to cue you into at arm's reach in front of you at your desk to cue you into engaging in the habit makes it so much easier. And if we're not having to look at temptations, it makes it easier to resist them. And the brain has to make 250 food choices alone a day. And so each time you have to make a choice, you're depleting yourself again and again and again. So if we can engineer our environment that there's less of those choices, it makes it easier to resist temptation. And then over time, as our intrinsic motivation grows and we learn more ways to navigate temptation, then it makes it easier in those circumstances, like when you go into work, to realize, actually, you know what, today isn't the day for this. Or actually, yeah, I'm going to have one because I know I can get back on track quite quickly afterwards.
I think that these cues are really like or doing an environmental audit, as you said, is really the invisible driver of our lives, right? Even if you think of cues or prompts, let's say, your oven beeps when it's finished cooking. And what do? Well, that drives the behavior of you walking over to check on whatever you're cooking. You pull it out or you leave it in again and you set the timer. Same thing, right? When you go outside and it's raining, that's a cue. You're like, oh, I should get my umbrella out, and I open my umbrella, and so there's all of these different, like in our everyday life. You're driving, you see a red light. That's a cue for you to press on the brake, not on the gas, right?
Yeah.
So these are all cues, right? Like these are all driving our behaviors. You said, like, what's on the home screen, right? Is it, do you want to meditate more? Are you getting, the notification? Like for me, I'm a Duolingo aficionado. So I have, Duolingo will prompt me if I haven't done my lesson, let's say for the day. One of the characters will be like, hey, you want to give up your, however many day streak you have, like get on the app. And I'm like, oh yeah, I got to do my French today. So I think that thinking about setting yourself up with these, like that environmental audit, I think is so important because it grabs our attention, right? Like the oven grabs our attention so that we don't burn the food, right? The green light prompts us to go so that the cars behind us, don't hit us or whatever. So I think that this is where we kind of, I was talking about how do we overcome motivation. I think that this is also, and I'd love your thinking on this. This is how we maybe circumvent motivation. Like, as you said, if you open the door of the fridge and it's like all the celery's already chopped up, you've got salads ready to go. The dressing is like freshly made, or your meats are marinated in whatever marinade. All you have to do is like pull it out, kind of throw it all together, and then it's done, right? Like that's a way for you to overcome the motivation of like, okay, I got to marinate the chicken breast, then I got to chop up the tomatoes, and then I got to make the dressing, and then I got to do the thing. Like all of that, like thinking about all of those things that you have to do, like the chicken, the cutting, and the grilling, the this and the that, like all of that is, as you said, like it's decision fatigue. It chips away at your motivation. But if it's already kind of pre-done and you just have to grab it from the fridge, toss it together, maybe throw it on the skillet for a couple minutes, that environmental setup is how we can potentially circumvent or overcome the lack of motivation in that moment. Because there are plenty of times where I know that I have to get dinner on the table for my family. I like to sort of putter around the kitchen on the weekends. But during the week, it's like, we got to do soccer. Like they got to get their homework done. It's like, then I got to drive them to soccer. And then I have all these different things that are vying for my attention. So I always meal prep. Like on Sunday, I take a lot of time to like cut up all the things. I do the shopping, cut up all the things. So it's all ready to go for me and for the kids, so that when it's time I can put dinner together in about 20 to 30 minutes, because all the stuff is kind of pre-done for me. And if it wasn't, if I had the resources to have a chef, I totally would. But until that point, until I have that asset, that's what's going to work for me right now, is like setting up my environment in a way that I know that when I'm in a pinch, when my motivation is really low, I'm stressed, I know we have like 45 minutes before I got to get in the car and take them to soccer, that I can kind of whip something up for them in like 20, 25 minutes.
And that's skill power at its best. You're not waiting to rely on your willpower. You're like, well, what skills have I got? What skills can I develop that are going to help me? And that's such a huge part of habit change. And I talked about implementation intentions earlier, but it's about knowing that we're vulnerable when we're stressed, knowing that we're vulnerable when we've got to get the kids out to soccer, knowing that these are the situations in which I go off track. And, I think it's important for people to take some time out when they're trying to think about habit change. And at the very, very get-go, ask themselves, what's going to get in the way of me being successful at this change? And if that happens, what options are available to me at this time? And exactly like we talked about, the scaling option is one way of doing it. Or asking yourself, so for a lot of people, stress might get in the way. So if you're asking yourself, okay, well, if I normally meal prep for the week to overcome this, what might get in the way of that? And how can I overcome that? And how can my most depleted self, most exhausted self, overcome that as well? Because again, we need to think about our future selves. We all think about our future selves as these perfect beings.
Yeah, Sunday morning when you have the whole day to lounge over a coffee and a croissant or something. Yeah.
Like unflawed, flawless people. And we have all of the self-restraint and the willpower in the world, but we're flawed, and we have to accept that, and accept that we will give in to temptation. And so we need to approach it whenever we're creating a new change, asking ourselves, what's going to most likely to get in the way? And the thing is, you'll know that because it'll have happened time and time and time again in the past. And that's often the tipping point where people actually go off track. And it makes me really frustrated, because actually that's the learning point. That actually is the inflection point. That's a really important time where actually, failure is success if you learn from it, which was one of the conclusions of one of our studies of long-term maintainers. Those that were able to maintain their habits 5 years or more, maintain a clinically significant weight loss 5 years or more, versus those that actually went off track after a year or two. And what we found was that they were actually able to bounce back best from failures. And that's often because they were able to see their future selves and see the barriers and the blockages that would get in the way. And they were able to actually pre-plan and actually set up an environment for success where they increased friction to unhelpful behaviors and they increased fuel to helpful behaviors. And what I mean by that is they made those helpful behaviors more obvious, more salient in their physical environment, in their social environment, in their emotional environment. And they made those unhelpful behaviors harder to do. And that's a huge piece when it comes to long-term behavior change.
When we're talking about skill power, so if we're moving from, to use your terminology, if we're moving from willpower to skill power, in that example that I gave you where like I'm on soccer mom duty, like I have a time crunch there, right? So that's something that I've identified. So there's like a time restraint that I have in the evening from the time that the boys get home, they do their homework, and then we're kind of on the go, taking them to soccer practice back and forth and so on. But I think that I think it would be helpful, or at least it's been helpful for me when I think about, okay, where am I going to get stuck? Like it's going to be, I'm going to get stuck with time. Maybe I'll get stuck, I'll fall off my routine. So how can I get back on the routine? And we talked a little bit about that already with, having that flexibility to say, okay, you don't get it done right in the morning, but, maybe it gets done in the afternoon or, or later in the evening or something like that. But I think that there's also a couple of other restraints. One of them is like mental effort, right? So what is does the behavior that you're looking to adapt, does that use a lot of mental energy? And then I would say from a weight loss and like body recomposition perspective, there's also like a physical effort, right? So do you have the physical ability to do the behavior that you're setting out to do, right? Like, can you actually work out 4 or 5 times a week without killing yourself? And then I guess the other, I'm sure there's others that I'm forgetting, but I would also think like a money resource. Like I kind of mentioned, like if I can, until I can afford, the chef, like I gotta do this thing myself. What are some other, and maybe I've covered them. I know that there are things that I haven't. So like financial, time, physical, mental effort. What are some other restraints that we might identify, if any? And then what are some actionable items? Like for me, it's like, I know I have a time restraint on like Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays. Like the food has to be done and prepped on those days. So what are some actionable items that we might think about in either of those categories, let's say, or if there's any sort of restraints that I've missed?
Yeah, and I think what you're alluding to, and I don't know if you're doing this intentionally or not, but either way, it's brilliant, is the COM-B model of behavior change, which is about capability, opportunity, motivation. And then those are the 3 key factors that can influence then behavior, which is the B. So capability being the C, opportunity being the O, and motivation being the M. And
what is that called? It's called the COM-B
model, and that's come out of University College London, and Susan Michie is the research around that. And it talks about how, we need to have a certain level of capabilities, be them physical or emotional capabilities, to undertake a particular behavior. We need to have the opportunities available to us, the resources available to us, and we need to have the motivation. And we need to look at motivation in terms of automatic motivation and then more long-term controlled motivation as well. And those are key factors that actually influence someone's ability then to carry out a behavior. And so you beautifully summarized that, absolutely to the point. Another layer that I would bring in as well is from self-determination theory. And self-determination theory is one of the most studied theories in psychology. There's over 40 years of research on it. And it's all about what does it take to create lasting change. And for someone to be self-determined, so actually they're self-motivated, they have that intrinsic level of motivated, they're doing it for themselves, and though time and time again in studies, those are shown to be people that are able to stick at their goals best. They need to have certain basic needs that are nourished. And those basic needs are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So autonomy means that the person needs to feel like they have ownership over their behavior. They need to feel like they have control over the behavior. Competence means that they need to feel confident in their ability to execute the behavior. And relatedness is actually, they need to feel socially related to others, that they're not alone in their pursuit, that they're actually part of something bigger than themselves. And when each of these needs are nurtured, it's much more likely that someone will develop their intrinsic motivation, and it's much more likely then in time that they'll stick to this goal. And so if you want to think about your own habits themselves, do you feel a certain level of ownership? Do you feel a certain level of control? Do you feel a certain level of accountability and responsibility in your habits? Do you feel competent? Do you feel confident? And how can you build that confidence? We often talk about small changes because it's a beautiful way of actually building your confidence and your competence around a behavior. And do you feel related? Do you feel like there's others? Do you feel like you've a tribe? Do you feel like you've a community? Do you feel like you're feeling understood and heard when it comes to pursuing a particular behavior change? Be it a habit that you wish to develop in work, be it a healthy habit. It's regardless of it, self-determination theory shows that when these needs are nurtured, we're much more likely to be successful at long-term change. And on the flip side, when these needs are thwarted, we're much less likely to be successful at long-term change. And so those are some of the key factors that actually can obscure someone and their ability to follow their long-term goals. And I would say for anyone, just on this note, while I'm thinking of it, if they want to understand a little bit more about their habits, if they want to understand what gets in the way, and this made me think of a study that we did a few years ago, was maybe think about becoming a habit detective. And what I mean about that is become curious about what's driving those unhelpful habits. And one way to do that is just to do a temptation tracker for a week. And that will give you a huge amount of insight into, is it a particular time of day? Is it a particular person? Is it a particular situation that throws you off track? And there's 4 things you can track in your temptation tracker. You can track what the temptation is. So, is it eating a chocolate out of the fridge? Is it browsing news websites when you should be working? When you're most likely to give in to temptation, so a particular time of day or context. Where are you most likely to give in to temptation? Is it, in the kitchen? Is it at work? Is it, on your way home from work? Whatever it happens to be, when you're doing things with the kids, maybe when you're out in a restaurant. And why did you give in to that temptation? And that's the sticky part there. That's really, really interesting. And you might not always be obvious about why, or it might be super obvious. It's that, someone left a plate of M&Ms out on the counter. And so, you were giving into temptation, or you walk past a bakery on your way home from work and the weight of the warm cinnamon buns, who could resist that? That is what the cue was for you, or the trigger was for you to engage in temptation. But that exercise alone can be hugely insightful. And you don't need any particular apps, you don't need any particular, anything bar a pen and a paper or your phone. And just anytime you feel like you're tempted over the week, ask yourself those 4 questions. What was the temptation? When was the temptation? Where was I? And why? And if you can really dig into that why, and even ask yourself, am I hungry? Am I stressed? Am I tired? Am I bored? Am I frustrated? Am I angry? Or maybe it's just something that's in my physical environment. And count yourself lucky if it's one of those physical environment things, because they're a lot easier to change.
Those are the easy ones. Yeah.
States.
You just delete it. Yeah.
And develop a curiosity. Become this detective, because actually that can really tell you what these triggers are for you, because for each person it is individual. And while, we know from studies that there are kind of 4 or 5 main things, and Stephanie, you talked about them, time and emotional energy and everything else, that's useful to know. Let's break it down to a personal individual factor. Let's look at what are those for you, and just try that over a week. Try get some weekend days in, try and get some weekdays in, and actually you'll discover some incredible patterns. Like in our study, we found that people were most tempted around 3:30 and 8:30 in the day. And 3:30 is what I like to term the biscuit slump. And for some people, it was because they didn't have a sustainable enough lunch. For other people, it was because that's the height of stress in their day. For other people, it was boredom at that time. And
that's the time you get the kids. That's the time you pick up the kids.
Yeah, it's the time you pick up the kids, and they come back and they have their snacks, and you start eating their snacks from the cupboard. But what's wonderful is once you know these things, then you can start to think about, well, what can I do to actually engineer a more helpful habit into my life? If I know that that's a trigger or cue, what's another behavior that I could perform at that time? And that can be really, really interesting to play around with. And we talked about, habits are on a loop. So you've got a cue or trigger, you've got your routine or your behavior, and that's in response for a particular reward. And be it helpful or unhelpful habits, they all serve a reward. And that's why I always say, all habits serve a function. So let's think about, brushing your teeth in the morning. The cue is to go into the bathroom. The behavior is brushing your teeth. The reward is positive dental hygiene or fresh breath. Think about a behavior that often happens at work. The cue is you get bored. So you have the need to procrastinate. You flip out your phone, you go on social media. That's the behavior, or a news website. And the reward is you relieve that need to procrastinate. But the problem is, the more you repeat that behavior, the more it becomes a habit. And so that loop continues. And so when we're thinking about those unhelpful habits, once we've tracked them and we know when they're happening and potentially why, we can start to reverse engineer them. If we understand the why, if we understand what's driving us in the first place. So for example, if it's stress, well, what else could we do at that time to relieve stress? Or what else could we do at other times during the day to crowd out that unhelpful habit? Because often, we put so much effort into actually trying to fix a habit or break a habit completely. And actually the science shows that that's ineffective. That's not a great way of using your energy. You're better to crowd out those unhelpful habits with helpful habits. So often for many of us, stress tends to be the main driver of those bad habits or unhelpful habits. So what helpful habits can we develop around stress? And how can we recognize our cues and our triggers better? So actually we can reverse engineer those things. So we can set up our environment so, we don't have those unhealthy snacks available at that time, because we know that that's the time that we're most triggered, or that we can do something else in that circumstance that actually helps relieve that stress.
I think that's so great. I was talking to Kelly Levesque. She's a specialist in blood sugar management, and she was talking about what you just said sort of triggered a memory of her on the show, and she said something to the effect of, if you say no in the grocery store, let's say, to the chips or the cookies or the crackers, like you only have to say no once, versus if you bring them home, and then the kids pull them out at 3:30, like you have to say no every single day that they come home, right? So which one's easier? It's like no one time, or no every single day, or no every single time you walk by the kitchen and know that the cookies are just, just in the cupboard.
That. Yeah, they kind of, the sirens call. There's a really fun study. I'm just going to talk about one more study. You're probably up to your eyes in temptation resistance studies at this stage, but there's a really fun study that they did in workplaces and receptionists, and they put a jar of M&Ms, an open jar of M&Ms on some of their desks, and then in the other workplaces they put them 6 feet away. And those that had them 6 feet away ate, over the period of time in the study, I think it was like 300 calories less than those that were on their desks. And it was the proximity that actually, and this is why we talk about friction. You want to have more friction. You want to move it as far away as possible. You want to leave it in the grocery store. You don't want to have to be walking past knowing that they're there. And that's exactly what they found in this study, that those that had it far away, even though it was only 6 feet away, made it much less likely that they'd engage in that temptation. So definitely, if you keeping sweets on your desk and you're trying to cut out your cut down your sugar. It's going to be extremely hard because you're relying on your willpower rather than your skill power to set your environment up for success.
And you can do, that's not to say that you can never have M&Ms. Like
No.
you can allow yourself and say, listen,
enjoy.
Yeah, I'm going to have M&Ms. I'm just not going to keep any in the house. So if I want M&Ms right now, I'm going to go to the corner store or the gas station or the supermarket, and I'm going to get myself a single serving size of the M&Ms, right? But if you think about all of the, the friction, as you said, right? Like the barriers to entry versus just being in the cupboard where you're like, okay, I got to get in my car and drive, and then I got to go to the store, and then I got to find a
You got to really want those M&Ms.
You got to really want them, right? You got to really want them.
And it's a conscious decision making, and that's what you're talking about. It's not a non-conscious thing. It's not like, oh, they're there, I'll just have them because they're here. I circumstantially just ended up in this position and now they're here. You're making a conscious decision to actually have them. And that's important that we do that. And it is important that we have things that are unhealthy. This is not, again, going back to, Stephanie, what you alluded to earlier about, it's not about all or nothing. Actually, in fact, it's very important to have things that you think are off plan or maybe, not exactly what you think is the healthiest, because the importance is the bounce back. It's the resilience. It's what happens afterwards.
Yeah, that is so important. Speak a little bit, if you can, around why it's important for this change to happen in a positive mental state. Like, I think I assumed before kind of diving into some of the science for my clients that, I think that people often, well, we'll say it this way, maybe people often, I would notice, and in myself included, started habits because, we felt bad about ourselves in some way, right? Like doctors telling us that our fasting glucose is out, or our lipids are not right, or we have to lose weight, or, so we often, I would think that most people start habits because there's something that they want to change about themselves. And you talk a lot about this idea that the positive emotion itself, like feeling good, is the thing that actually wires in the habit. And that makes sense from a neurological perspective. So I'll just kind of hold my comments, but I wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about why change happens best through positive emotions rather than like publicly ridiculing yourself or, being your own worst critic or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I absolutely love this piece. And I think this is actually one of my main drives to actually, be in the career of behavioral change. Going right back to the first question is I feel like, in a way, and not to be evangelical about it, but I feel like it's important for me, knowing the research, to help people find joy in healthy habits. And the thing is, like you said, change is hard. Making those small changes can be incredibly frustrating. Not seeing instant results is incredibly frustrating. Being persistent is frustrating. But change is harder if we're hard on ourselves about it. And thoughts are habits too, as well. And, if we develop this negative repetition in our brain, it's only going to not serve us. It's not going to help us get to our goals any faster. But it's so funny when people adopt new habits, like think about anyone joining a gym, they scan the gym floor and they look for like that maximally punishing Stairmaster or the assault bike, and they're like, right, I have to do that because that's the hardest thing to do. That must be the most beneficial. Or, January, they go to the store and they're like, right, I'm going to buy kale and, I'm going to do steamed broccoli and fish every night, and after like a week, they're just like, oh God, this is so bland. And they feel like somehow their future self is going to have the willpower to just, suddenly fall in love with having broccoli every night. And, we commit to those goals for a couple of weeks, but it gets joyless and it gets hard and we disengage. And there's another study involving M&Ms, which is kind of one of the themes now of the studies I'm talking about today. They must be on my mind, and I'll have everyone craving M&Ms after this because I've mentioned them so many times. But there was two groups of women, and they were getting they were trying to develop walking habits, and they got one group to go and walk for exercise, and they got another group to go and walk for fun. And they brought them back into the research lab, and they got them to fill out a load of psychometric questionnaires afterwards, as they always do in these psychology studies. And what they found when they followed up 3 months later was those that they had told in the study to walk for exercise were walking about half as much as those that were walking for fun. And what they also found was when they were filling out those psychometric questionnaires, and this is what I love about psychology studies, there's always a hidden incentive behind them. But they had left open a bowl of M&Ms beside the questionnaires. And so when the women came back and they were filling out the questionnaires, they actually measured how many M&Ms they ate. And what they found was,
Plot twist.
Cheeky, right? Really
Yeah.
deceptive. I love it. So smart. But what they found was that those who were walking for exercise, for benefits, they were thinking about the health benefits just alone, rather than fun or enjoyment. They ate twice as many M&Ms than those that were walking for fun.
Wow.
And I found that so fascinating, because it was
fascinating. Yeah.
Doesn't it really resonate as well? Because it's like they were the ones that felt more deprived. They felt like they created a regime. And I always find this, it's always a trigger for me as well. It's always a click for me when someone says my exercise regime rather than their routine or what they do for exercise. And I think, Mary Poppins put it best. She says, in every task that must be done, there's an element of fun.
Oh, yeah.
Snap, you find the fun, the job's a game. And, anyone who's got kids will understand that, and if we want to get kids to engage in exercise, we bring them to playground because it's fun. If we want them to eat vegetables, we make them into the shape of a dinosaur because that's fun. But yet as adults, we don't focus on this fun. We focus far too much on, what needs to be grueling, what needs to be hard, because if it's not tough, it's not worthwhile. But actually, that's not effective. And actually, what they found in studies time and time again is those that choose foods they enjoy, those that choose healthy activities that they enjoy, they're the ones that stick to it long term. Because ultimately, if you can find the joy, the rest becomes easy for you. And that's a huge unlock in terms of actually activating those positive emotions in your brain and actually helping your brain learn, because dopamine is a learning hormone in your brain, as you will well know, Stephanie. And it's the pat on the back you get for doing a good job. If you're constantly telling yourself this isn't enough, or I'm not trying hard enough, or I did, a 30-minute HIIT session, I could have done, let's not talk about HIIT sessions. It's probably not a HIIT anymore if we're doing 40 minutes, but, I did a 30-minute run. I should have done a 40-minute run. Or you're saying, oh, well, I only meditated for 15 minutes and I only did this and this was not enough. It's how we often talk to ourselves. That's not telling our brain this is something good to do. It's not telling our brain I want to do it again and again and again. Whereas on the flip side, if we do things we enjoy, it releases positive emotions. It gives us that dopamine response. It tells our brain, hey, let's do this again and again and again. And so I always say to people when they're starting out in their healthy habit journey, can you create a joy list? Can you write down those activities that you enjoy? Or if you're already on your habit journey, ask yourself, well, how can I layer joy into this habit? So say you go walking every day, how can you make it more fun? How can you make it more engaging? Can you listen to podcasts that you love? Can you listen to audiobooks? Maybe there's definitely, when it comes to your batch cooking, is that when you watch that Netflix documentary or that trashy TV show that you love? Do you only do that when you're batch cooking? That's a technique called temptation bundling. And it's actually doing something really fun at the time to make it more engaging for you to actually engage in that task. And then there's a third part of joy that's really important as well. And that comes back to what we talked about, resisting temptation to not do it. And that's about thinking about the end state after you carry out a helpful behavior or a healthy behavior. So for example, if you're weighing up the pros and cons of going on a run when it's cold, if you start to tell yourself about, oh yeah, well, how do I feel when I finished? What are those feelings of, accomplishment, achievement, clarity when I finish a workout, If you can tune into those, it makes it much more likely that, you'll strap on your trainers, you'll get your gym kit going and you'll get out that door. But so often we think of the negative, we think of all the things we're deprived of, we think about how hard it is, rather than actually, all the positive feelings that we get from engaging in a particular behavior. So I've said a lot there, but what I'll summarize and say is, create a joy list and focus on those behaviors or those particular elements of the behaviors that bring you joy, because that makes it much more likely that you'll engage and you'll continue to engage.
Well, that's the secret sauce right there. That's so juicy. It's like the best program the best diet you could ever follow is the one that you enjoy eating. It's like the best movement program that you could ever design is the one that you enjoy doing. Like if you love to salsa dance, like you should be salsa dancing. Like that should be part of your, that should be part of your program. That should be integrated into that joyful, into that, like that should be on your joy list. And there should be a way for you to, as you said, like bundle all the things together, like all of the good habits together. That's
like really hard doesn't mean helpful, and we think, oh yeah, if it's not hard, it's not worthwhile. If I'm not punishing myself or beating myself with a big stick, then why should I bother?
Hey, if you enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Heather McKee, as I did, check out this next video coming up right here for some more tips.